Come right on in, everybody. And once all are populated, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of February. Today's speaker is Joseph Alulis, and Joe's title today is Publius, Tocqueville, and Burke on Federalism, Democracy, and Revolution, Lessons for Our Time. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type into the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Joe at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Joe and I will be able to see your video, but will not be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is entirely at your discretion. Joe's video will be spotlit for the most part during the presentation. In fact, I've already done that, I think. The best way to view is to set Zoom controls to speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the basic program of liberal education for adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. And where is PowerPoint? There we are. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. The Basic Program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School. That's the problem. At the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the basic program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there is no substitute for direct engagement with big ideas in their original texts. Through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Most of our classes still take place remotely, although this year we are offering a small number of courses in person downtown. Registration for spring quarter courses opens Monday, so keep your eyes peeled for them. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on March 3, and the speaker will be BP instructor Paul Cato. Paul's title will be, It Might Be Made to Bear the Burden of My Experience, a testimonial analysis of the Black existence and the Western canon. The First Friday lecture series will continue monthly throughout the academic year. Coming up on Friday, February 24, we have another installment of our successful series of basic program movie nights. The discussion will begin at 6 p.m. The movie we will watch in advance is Persona. BP student Jim Rice is spearheading this movie night. Thanks, Jim. I'm looking forward to it. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. Our speaker today is Joe Alulis. Joseph Alulis has a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He has published articles on Tocqueville, Lincoln, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and the filmmaker Whit Stillman, and is co-editor of 2 collections of scholarly essays, Tocqueville's Defense of Human Freedom, which came out in 1993, and Shakespeare's Political Pageant from 1996. Joe's most recent publication is To Make High Majesty Look Like Itself, Shakespeare's Richard II and the Nature of the Good Regime. Joe has held appointments at 3 area colleges: Loyola University of Chicago, Lake Forest College, and North Park University, where he recently retired as professor of politics and government and chair of the department. At North Park, his teaching responsibilities included American foreign policy, international politics, and politics of the Middle East. Joe first taught in the basic program in 1982. His scholarly interests include political philosophy, American political thought, and the thought of Shakespeare, Tocqueville, Lincoln, Dostoevsky, and Saul Bellow. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to Joe.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Kendall. And let me begin my talk. Kendall, I'll be signaling to you with the word slide when I'd like you to advance a slide. Now, on my screen, I don't see the slides. Are they there? Here we go. All right. So my talk has both a title and a subtitle. Let me start with the latter. Is our time one of national political crisis? No time is without its troubles. How do ours compare with those of earlier periods of our country's history? This talk will not attempt to make such a comparison, but I will start with a statement of what I think our troubles are. Slide. In searching for a nonpartisan formulation, one that might be broadly acceptable, I have come up with 3 related ills: polarization, paralysis, and instability. Polarization of the electorate leading to paralysis in Congress, which in turn contributes to instability in our politics. Of these, the key is the first, polarization, and that is the one on which I will focus. The lessons we need are those which can help us understand the causes and remedies of polarization. My title states my point of departure in the search for these lessons in terms of issues and thinkers. To begin with the former, contemporary public debate and opinion direct attention to the ideas of federalism, democracy, and revolution. Federalism and democracy are sometimes portrayed as in opposition to each other. Calls are made for radical change that might well be characterized as revolutionary. Serious concern has been raised about threats to our democracy. Our country's revolutionary past is evoked to rally political action and sometimes to justify violence. In reflecting on these ideas, slide, it seemed best to turn to thinkers who may be deemed foundational for the understanding of liberal democratic politics in the United States. Publius is a pen name shared by 3 different persons: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, all nicely pictured in the handsome flyer advertising this talk. And I will have occasion to note some differences among them. As a matter of fact, I did not include that, so that in fact won't happen. But I will generally treat Publius as one, the defender of the Constitution of 1787. These 3 then, Publius, Alexis de Tocqueville, and Edmund Burke, all wrote within a half century that witnessed a critical phase of the revolutionary struggle to establish liberal democracy in the West. For this reason, and for 3 others, they are a valuable resource for my inquiry. All were political actors as well as authors. Each has a special claim on our attention as regards one of the issues to be considered, and all, as thinkers from another time than our own, are unimpeded by our political prejudices. This is not to say they had no prejudices of their own, only that they might help us see things of importance which, without their insights and arguments, we would not. Having stated my reasons for looking at these authors and noted the texts which I think most helpful, I must admit that my project, when I proposed this lecture, was too ambitious. My focus will be on Publius, with Tocqueville playing only a minor supportive role and Burke not entering the discussion at all. Slide. As my focus is polarization, it's incumbent on me to define it. My definition consists of an appropriation from Publius's candid reflection on the debate in which he was engaged. He acknowledges that the proposal of a plan for radical change of government would arouse strong feeling on one side and the other. He proceeds to distinguish strong feelings from a predetermination in the matter. If the first is unfriendly, the second is fatal to a, quote, fair discussion and accurate judgment of its merits, the merits of the plan of government. He says that he is writing only for those who are not predetermined. But he then argues that, quote, as our situation is universally admitted to be peculiarly critical, unquote, a predetermination to approve the plan is not on a par with a predetermination to oppose it. Quote, the intentions of the first may be upright, as they may, on the contrary, be culpable. The views of the last cannot be upright and must be culpable, unquote. My definition includes both ideas. First, a significant portion of the electorate is predetermined one way or the other on important policy issues. Such persons are not open to argument against their position. But such unwillingness is an impediment to deliberation and decision. Second, many of those predetermined are so for culpable reasons. Whereas Publius was dealing with one issue and blaming one side, my definition is more open. There are more issues, and both sides on each are equally liable to be culpable. Culpability in this case means insufficient regard for the public good. Slide. A persuasive argument of the phenomenon of polarization starts with a place where it is very much on display, our elections, in particular, elections to Congress. This interpretation traces the following dynamic. As elections become more competitive, each party becomes more partisan. The hope of a victory at the next poll means the minority party has no incentive to compromise with the majority. Fear of dilution of its electoral identity makes the majority reluctant to compromise within its own ranks. Slide. Slide. Nope, go back one, please. There you go. The cause of polarization is the lack of a consensus among the electorate. Slide. Granted that this account of the dynamics of polarization rests on a depressingly familiar description of contemporary politics, my thesis looks to the other end of the political continuum, not the electorate, but the elected. As the old adage has it, the fish rots from the head. It is the responsibility of leaders to build consensus. How is that done? How do we understand the inability of contemporary leaders to do so successfully? What can be done to change this situation in the short term and the long term? And here I've put on the slide my thoughts on the issues that I've just mentioned. Slide. In what follows, I will elaborate my idea of a failure of leadership, its causes and remedies in terms of the three issues of federalism, democracy, and revolution. The first is on the agenda, partly because one proposed electoral reform in our current situation is the abolition of the Electoral College. Rather than a remedy, I think this proposal flows from the ill that needs to be cured. At the same time, I think Publius calls attention to other aspects of our present troubles among leaders and electorate that are worth noting. Now, as I've already indicated, in fact, I don't get to revolution at all. And I touch on the democracy part only slightly. In fact, I found the topic of federalism so engaging as I pursued it that this will occupy the bulk of my talk. So, federalism. In its broadest sense, a federation is a union of states. The 13 colonies formed such a union in response to what they saw as unjust treatment by the British Parliament. That union dates from 1774, when the colonies sent representatives to the First Continental Congress to deliberate a collective response to the sanctions Britain imposed on Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. As Publius notes, quote, that body recommended certain measures to their constituents, unquote, opposed by many in the press at the time, he notes, quote, and the event proved their wisdom, unquote. By reason of their union, the 13 colonies won their independence. Slide. The first three parts of Publius's program, as announced in the first number of The Federalist, all revolve around the project of preserving the Union. He writes to persuade those open to argument, first, that the Union is necessary for prosperity. Second, that the Confederation cannot preserve it. Third, that only a government as strong as the one proposed can do so. Slide. Now, this is a very busy slide because I've included in summary fashion a number of articles from the Articles of Confederation. Let me talk about them now, and you have the details in front of you. Under the Articles of Confederation, the government of the United States of America, the title of the Confederation as designated by the first article, was vested in a Congress of the representatives of the states. Article 2 stipulates that, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States, unquote. The delegates to Congress, as laid out in Article 5, quote, shall be annually appointed in such manner as the legislature of each state shall direct, unquote. There were to be no fewer than 2 and no more than 7. As the delegates were paid by the states that sent them, the states could decide for themselves how many they wished to support. Whatever the number of delegates, each state had 1 vote, Article 5. And for the original 13 members, 9 votes were required for any significant action of the Confederation. That's Article 9. Amendment required the unanimous consent of all state legislatures. Finally, Congress was dependent upon the states for revenue necessary to defray its expenses. Once it determined the proportion each state had to pay to a, quote, common treasury, unquote, Article 8 stipulated, quote, taxes for paying that proportion shall be laid and levied by the authority and direction of the legislatures of the several states, unquote. In short, the federal government had no power to tax. Publius begins the second part of his program, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union, with a, quote, dark catalog of public misfortunes, unquote, caused by this form of national government. The critical weakness was the sovereignty of the individual states. Exercising this sovereignty, the states violated engagements made by the United States and failed to supply the funds Congress assessed as their respective proportions of the common expenses. The result was that the Confederation had neither, quote, troops, nor treasury, nor government, unquote, to defend the Union's territory, pay its debts, and administer its affairs. As Publius writes, quote, the great and radical vice in the construction of the existing Confederation is in the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, and as contradistinguished from the individuals for whom they consist, unquote. Slide. It has been observed that in the debate over the ratification of the Constitution of 1787, the advocates for ratification scored a rhetorical victory at the expense of the truth by claiming the title of Federalists. This is based on the ground stated in this slide that by definition, a federal system of government is one in which the community that is governed consists of sovereign entities. If the community of the governed consists of individuals, it is a national government. Slide. On this ground, the true Federalists were those labeled Anti-Federalists. So in the left column is the form of government being advocated, and then in the right column, the two parties in the debate over the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists really being the true Federalists, and the Federalists being nationalists. Slide. Publius bases his claim to the title Federalist on the ground that he sought to increase the powers of the federal government. This could be done only by reducing the power of the states, and this involved a change more thoroughgoing than a different distribution of governmental functions. It was a question of sovereignty. As Publius puts it, the opponents of the Constitution who agree that the federal government needs to be stronger, quote, seems still to aim at things repugnant and irreconcilable, at an augmentation of federal authority without a diminution of state authority, at sovereignty in the Union and complete independence in the members, unquote. The fatal flaw in the Confederation was Article 2, the sovereignty of the states. The Union could endure only if the Union's government exercised sovereignty, and there cannot be two such bodies in any political community. Publius calls the idea that there can be, quote, the political monster of an imperium in imperio, unquote. Insofar as all legitimate authority rests on the people, the federal government, if it was to exercise sovereignty, must be accountable to the people. A federal government that consisted of a Congress made up of delegates appointed by state legislatures that could not limit the independent actions of those legislators was doomed to, quote, imbecility, unquote, and the inevitable death, either violent or natural. So the imbecility of government is a favorite phrase of Publius. He uses it repeatedly. The Declaration of Independence, however, called for a federation of states as well as national independence. It asserted that, quote, these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, unquote. Article 2 incorporates that idea in the Confederation. In order to support his argument that state sovereignty constitutes, quote, the great and radical error, unquote, of that government, Publius surveys a number of confederations known to history, ancient and modern, the Achaean League, as well as contemporary Switzerland. His conclusions are twofold. Slide. Now, this shows, the next two slides will show the different federations that Publius looked at and the numbers of the Federalist paper of the Federalist in which he did so. And then in addition, I've noted these two conclusions. So here's the first. Every confederation of sovereign states had a weak federal government. Experience shows, quote, a sovereignty over sovereigns, a government over governments, a legislation for communities as contradistinguished from individuals. As it is a solecism in theory, so in practice, it is subversive of the order and ends of civil polity, unquote. The distinguishing feature of the United Netherlands, for example, included, quote, a precarious existence in peace and peculiar calamities from war, unquote. The confederations of which we have any knowledge, Publius concludes, quote, furnish no other light than that of beacons which give warning of the course to be shunned, unquote. On this slide, the Amphictyonic League had very little power and was as much a religious or concerned with religious practice as anything else. He devotes most attention in 19 to the Germanic Empire, very little to Poland, which he describes as a kind of government over local sovereignties, and the Swiss cantons. Finally, the entirety of 20 is devoted to the United Netherlands and is pretty engaging. It shows that Publius kept up with what was going on. It brings the story of the United Netherlands right up to the moment. Slide. The second conclusion is that a confederation need not exclude some rule over individuals by the general power. In two ancient cases, there is evidence of direct rule of individuals by the federal government. Drawing on Montesquieu, Publius notes that, quote, the Common Council, unquote, of the Lycian Confederation, quote, had the appointment of all the judges and magistrates of its members, unquote. Of another confederation, the Achaean League, he notes the report that, quote, cities were in a manner compelled to have the same laws and usages, unquote. He then regrets the limits of our knowledge of the Achaean League as a hindrance to what he calls, quote, the science of federal government, unquote. Slide. It fell to the framers of the Constitution to advance that science by their work. The Constitution provided a plan for a government that deserved the title the Confederation assumed, the United States of America, but shifted sovereignty from the individual states to the Union. The government for which it provided the plan was national insofar as it acted upon individuals, and federal because of the role the states played in its operation. Slide. Publius provides a useful analysis, a very detailed analysis of the way the proposed form of government is both national and federal in relation to different aspects of its composition and operation. In its foundation and in the extent of its power, it was federal. With respect to the operation of its power upon individuals, it was national. In the source of its power and as regards amendment, it was mixed. Once it was ratified, so I've laid that out for you. These are the 5 ways in which he considers, 5 aspects of the Constitution he considers. This is in Federalist number 39. And with respect to power, there are 3 elements, 3 aspects: source, operation, and extent. This is what I'll now talk about in explaining his reasoning. In its foundation, I just did that. Let's see. Once it was ratified by 9 states, this relates to foundation, it would come into being among those 9 states alone. In other words, the 9 states would not bind the other 4. As with the Confederation, ratification by the states that were part of the association would be unanimous. All 9 members would have agreed. In the source of its power, it was mixed. House members would be elected by individual citizens in each state, hence it's national. Members of the Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures, federal. And the president was elected by electors chosen by popular vote in each state, with the number of electors awarded each state not being simply proportional to the population of the state. And if the electors could not agree, the decision went to the House, where each state had 1 vote. Clearly, this is mixed. Amendment was also mixed. It did not have to be unanimous, but neither was it simply by majority. And the decision was by the vote of the states, not individual citizens of the whole United States. In the extent of its power, it was again purely federal. Publius's formulation is very guarded. The federal government's, quote, jurisdiction extends to certain enumerated objects only and leaves to the several states a residuary and inviolable sovereignty over all the others, unquote. Among the enumerated objects, matters common to all the states were prominent: national defense, foreign policy, trade with other nations, as well as interstate commerce. But other matters, like the Article 1, Section 10 prohibition of the states making, quote, any law impairing the obligation of contracts, unquote, could be seen as a local concern. This part of Publius's description of the new government gave rise to the concept of dual sovereignty, what elsewhere Publius calls a political monster. In another essay, he writes of the states as, quote, distinct and independent sovereigns, unquote. But this seems to be an exaggeration for rhetorical purposes to emphasize the government's continuing federal character. In line with his more accurate description of quote unquote residuary sovereignty, he writes in another essay, quote, as far as the sovereignty of the states cannot be reconciled to the happiness of the people, the voice of every good citizen must be, let the former be sacrificed to the latter, unquote. But the most virulent anti-federalists were unwilling to play the part of the good citizen as scripted by Publius. The very thing that Publius had shown by argument, evidence, and historical investigation to be incompatible with their happiness, state sovereignty, they saw as essential to their liberty. As a result, every power granted to the federal government was seen as part of a conspiracy to deprive them of their rights. In this respect, the debate over the Constitution resembles our contemporary politics. Jealousy of liberty, quote, raised the warmth of our zeal beyond the degree which consisted with the due temperature of the body politic, unquote. It's a nice way to talk about someone having a fever. In the first number of The Federalist, when the debate had already begun, Publius noted the way, quote, an over-scrupulous jealousy of danger to the rights of the people gave rise to an illiberal distrust. In the final essay, some 7 months later, he observes that, quote, the charge of a conspiracy against the liberties of the people, unquote, was repeatedly made against the Federalists in a manner he calls wanton and malignant. Some instances of this are worth noting. The inherited prejudice against standing armies maintained by a monarch gave rise to a suspicion of Congress's power to raise and support armies, albeit with appropriations that must be renewed every 2 years, as a threat to the people's liberty. Such a scheme, Publius reasons, would require, quote, a continued conspiracy for a series of time. Is it probable that such a combination would exist at all? Is it probable that it could be persevered in and transmitted along through all the successive variations in the representative body which biennial elections would naturally produce in both houses? Is it presumable that every man, the instant he took his seat in the National Senate or House of Representatives, would commence a traitor to his own constituents and to his country? If such presumptions can fairly be made, there ought to be once an end of all delegated authority, unquote. The proposed size of the House of Representatives is suspect. Might not the executive, with appointments to office, buy their support for an attempt to seize power? This was one of the charges the Anti-Federalists made. Publius responds, to suppose that these would be sufficient, the appointments to offices, to purchase the guardians of the people, selected by the people themselves, is to renounce every rule by which events ought to be calculated, and to substitute an indiscriminate and unbound jealousy with which all reasoning would be in vain. The sincere friends of liberty who give themselves up to the extravagancies of this passion are not aware of the injury they do their own cause, unquote. I'll do one more. The provision, Article 1, Section 4, that, quote, the times and places and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the place of choosing senators, unquote. Well, that's because the place of the senators were chosen by the legislature. So the exception is Congress cannot tell the states where their legislature is going to be. Okay. Some anti-federalists charged that this provision would be used, quote, to promote the election of some favorite class of men to the exclusion of others by confining the places of election to particular districts and rendering it impracticable to the citizens at large to partake in the choice, unquote. In this way, the federal government would create an aristocracy. Publius replies, quote, the improbability of the attempt may be satisfactorily inferred from the single reflection that it could never be made without causing an immediate revolt of the great body of the people, headed and directed by the state governments, unquote. In a moment of irritation, Publius characterizes charges like this, not without some justification, as, quote, the extravagant surmises of a distempered jealousy, unquote. But such lapses on Publius's parts were rare. In every case, even with lapses, Publius does make an argument in response to the charge. Given the magnitude of the change proposed, the presence of such irrational fear in some quarters is not unusual. In the end, the Constitution was ratified. The nation was not polarized as I have defined that phenomenon. The resemblance to some aspect of our contemporary politics invites the thought that the difference between then and now was the nature of our leadership. To what degree is that a matter of fortune? To what degree do we get the fortune we deserve? The genius of the framers was to retain a federal form, but to modify it in such a way as to avoid the defects of all previous federal governments. Publius reflects on the work in which he participated in order to dispel the fears of his fellow citizens. Quote, hearken not to the voice which petulantly tells you that the form of government recommended for your adoption is a novelty in the political world. Why is the experiment of an extended republic, that is to say, a union of states with sovereignty in the union, to be rejected merely because it may comprise what is new, unquote? He invites them to have the courage to act on a beneficial discovery. Quote, to this manly spirit, posterity will be indebted for the possession and the world for the example of the numerous innovations displayed on the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness, unquote. He encourages them to share his confidence that posterity will say of them, quote, they formed the design of a great confederacy, which it is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate, unquote. You might remark on what happened with our Civil War, which was in part a backsliding, a reassertion of state sovereignty in a sense which the Constitution had nullified. The people's attachment to their state governments made it necessary that the federal form be modified, not abandoned. It was Publius's task to dissuade them from the view that, quote, the operation of the federal government will by degrees prove fatal to the state governments, unquote. A principal reason for this is the division of responsibility, between the state and federal government, such that in relation to the extent of power, Publius characterized the proposed plan purely federal. That is to say, there was a division that the idea that it was purely federal, and speaking of the states as sovereign, is to talk about their having certain responsibilities. However much the power of the federal government has grown since the 18th century, it remains the case that, quote, the powers reserved to the states, unquote, deal with those matters which, quote, in the ordinary course of affairs, unquote, most concern the people. Publius observes at one point, quote, it would not be difficult to show that if the governments of the particular states were abolished, the general government would be compelled by the principle of self-preservation to reinstate them in their proper jurisdiction, unquote. The physical features, prevailing economic activity, and histories of different parts of the country shape the perceptions of the people who live there. As our experience shows, people from different states and regions tend to have different views on matters of national concern. And to the extent that these views are consistent with the national consensus as to the meaning of justice, their contribution adds to our deliberation. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville emphasizes an advantage of the federal system that, while implicit in the value the framers' generation placed on it, it fell to him to expound. In a chapter entitled Necessity of Studying What Takes Place in the Particular States before speaking of the government of the Union, he develops the idea that local government educates citizens in the art of freedom. Taking the state of Massachusetts as a case study, he examines township government and draws this conclusion. Quote, the institutions of a township are to freedom what primary schools are to science. They put it within reach of the people. They make them taste its peaceful employ and habituate them to making use of it. Without the institutions of a township, a nation can give itself a free government, but it does not have the spirit of freedom, unquote. His analysis persuaded Tocqueville that what made this education possible was the fact that, quote, the New England township unites two advantages that, everywhere they are found, keenly excite men's interest. That is to say, independence and power, unquote. If independence and power are necessary to the township, they are no less necessary to the state of which it forms a part, if this education in freedom is to take place. It is for this reason that the idea of abolishing the Electoral College, a perennial proposal that has once again become part of the national conversation, seems ill-advised. By giving added weight to the particular states, regardless of the size of their population, the Electoral College contributes to the education of the citizens in the art of freedom. This is the kernel of truth in the Anti-Federalist attachment to state sovereignty. In Federalist number 1, Publius declares of his role in the debate as an advocate for the Constitution, quote, "My motives must remain in the depository of my own breast. My arguments will be open to all," unquote. But he does not always refrain from comment on the possible motives of others when he thinks doing so sheds light on the debate. He notes, quote, "The obvious distinction between the interest of the people in the public felicity and the interest of their local rulers in the power and consequence of their offices," unquote. He goes on to observe, quote, "The scheme of separate confederacies, which will always multiply the chances of ambition, will be a never-failing bait to all such influential characters in the state administration as are capable of preferring their own emolument and advancement to the public weal," unquote. By the same token, one may speculate that at least some of those who advocate the abolition of the Electoral College do so simply because they think it enhances the chances of their party's candidates for the presidency. Others may be simply inattentive to the advantage for the country to be gained by this federal feature of our election of the president. But the former are guilty of what Publius calls, quote unquote, "the spirit of party," which he associates with faction, putting the advantage of the party ahead of the public good. This spirit is most active in the absence of common danger, which focuses the country's attention. But its unchecked leaven in our politics may insensibly lead the country into danger while it paralyzes our ability to deal with it. The Honorable Michael Luttig alluded to the corrosive effect of this spirit of party in his testimony before the January 6th committee last June, when he spoke of, quote, "partisan mercenaries," unquote, in our democracy. For mercenaries fight neither for king nor country, but for themselves alone. The cause of polarization in the country seems to be the growth of the spirit of party and the increase in the number of people in our political institutions who are actuated by it. Now I have a few words to say under the heading of democracy, the second of the three proposed issues, and in fact, this will be the last, and brief. An often quoted saying of Winston Churchill is, quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried," unquote. People tend to focus on the second part and neglect the first. This cannot be good for democracy. In the preface to the second volume of Democracy in America, Tocqueville anticipates the criticism that he has, quote unquote, "such severe words for contemporary democratic society." He writes, quote, "I shall respond simply that it is because I was not an adversary of democracy that I wanted to be sincere with it. Men do not receive the truth from their enemies, and their friends scarcely offer it to them. That is why I have spoken it," unquote. Since his time, democracy seems to have been elevated to a status that puts it beyond criticism in any way. For this reason, some readers of the Federalist are shocked by the fact that Publius has a negative opinion of pure democracy. In particular, Publius criticizes it for its incapacity to cure the mischief of faction. This is because in a popular government, it is precisely majority faction that is the great ill to be addressed. The remedy in which Publius places greatest confidence is the idea of an extended republic, which contains such a multiplicity of factions that it makes it less likely that any one will attain a majority. Another remedy in which he has less faith is the fact that a republic is a government in which, quote, the scheme of representation takes place, unquote. The republic offers promise because one might hope that the body of citizens chosen as representatives might be those, quote, whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations, unquote. But he concedes that, quote, the effect might be inverted. Men of factious tempers, of local prejudices, or of sinister design may by intrigue, by corruption, or by other means first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people, unquote. This seems to be the source of our current state of polarization, that too many of our leaders fall into this category. One question is whether there is some way to increase the likelihood that our elected officials will be less likely to meet this description. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville paints a negative picture of the House of Representatives in comparison with the Senate and attributes this to indirect election, namely that the senators were chosen by the state legislatures. He concludes, quote, "It is easy to perceive a moment in the future when the American republics will be forced to multiply the use of two stages in their electoral system under penalty of being miserably lost on the shoals of democracy," unquote. How ironic that the second stage which we have introduced is an election which seems to aggravate our problem, namely the primary. The spirit of Tocqueville's idea is that one needs to find a way to increase the role moderation and discretion play in the election of leaders. My short-term proposal to help remedy our current troubles is to eliminate primaries. The longer-term remedy, noted in an earlier slide, quote, education of society, unquote, is a matter for more extensive discussion. And unfortunately, I did not get to the last part of the plan, the consideration of revolution and Burke. Both of these topics will be matter for another occasion. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, welcome, Kendall.
And I see clapping. Did you see clapping in the squares? As is our practice at the end of the event, I will unmute everyone so Joe can hear the clapping. But right now, we have a number of questions that I've harvested from the chat function for you, Joe. Let's see here. The first question comes from Ray Lucchese, and Ray asks, "Don't you think the emergence of polarization is due to the changes to media requirements to be balanced in political discussions and the fact that much of the media today is biased and under no requirement to be balanced?"
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's not quite a silver bullet, but if I could do it just by my own say so, that would be one change I would make immediately, the restoration of the fairness doctrine. Absolutely. And, and the question then becomes, where did that come from? Well, it came from leaders, you could argue, that were motivated by a spirit of party. Why was that rule repealed? I mean, we know the mercenary interest of the individuals who benefit from it. Yeah, it's enough to raise the temperature, indeed. So, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. One of the things that a more respectable leadership could do would be to reinstate that rule.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Ray, for your question. The next question, closely following on that one, is from Syed Rahman, who asks, what is the role of social media in promoting polarization?
Well, this is a comment. I mean, this is a topic that everyone is addressing. I mean, we're all aware that the social media amplifies every little fear, jealousy, ill thought, etc. I mean, yeah, the problem of technology and its impact on our politics is enormous, and it's not clear how to handle that. I mean, I think of the image that Marx uses in the Communist Manifesto of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. We've really unleashed the monster with this technology. We have no idea what to do with it. I mean, I say we have no idea what to do with its harmful effects, and they seem to be enormous. So yes, social media, all the various media platforms of every sort, which serve to amplify a lot of these opinions, is a real problem, and everyone's aware of it. The difficulty is we don't seem to have a solution. Now, one solution might be legislation to try and regulate it more. That would take a lot of work. I don't know what people are working on that. I haven't read. There must be a literature emerging. You're going to need policy people to get a hold of that literature and try and design legislation. Well, then you need to persuade our legislators to adopt it, and that seems to be part of the problem. So yeah, all the media it complicates our life enormously.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Syed. The next question comes from Kenneth Krause, who asks, political polarization is an extension of pop culture. Average Americans' obsessions. Oh, I'm not sure there's a question mark coming up. Let's see. Average Americans' obsessions with America in parallel. Let's see. Okay, thank you for your comment, Kenneth. I'm going to move on to the next one that has a question for Joe. This one comes from N.E., who asks, polarization is not necessarily a populist phenomenon. May there also be polarization among a given set of elites? For example, Jefferson versus Adams.
Yeah, and again, you come to the Civil War. I mean, the leadership. It could have been handled differently, to say the least. I mean, if you go back and look at the first inaugural of Lincoln, he bends over backwards without ever abandoning his party's principles. He never abandons the principles in which he was elected, the platform of the Republican Party for 1860. But otherwise, he bends over backwards. So why weren't the adversaries willing to meet him halfway? Well, by that point, it was too late. So going all the way back to Jefferson and Adams, well, Jefferson, Hamilton, Hamilton, Adams, Adams, Jefferson. Yeah, if there could be more agreement among the elite, that would be better. And in fact, that was the whole point of my thesis, is to say that the people are being betrayed. The people are being betrayed by their leaders. It's not the fact that they can't reach a consensus. It's the fact that our leaders can't. That our leaders are not trying to. And the point which I was trying to make in the talk is that they're just short-sightedly not making an attempt to reconcile, to remedy the situation. You know, the oft-used image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. I mean, this is a calamity, and our leaders have no sense of how bad it is, and they need to get busy trying to resolve this. By the way, if I could just say one little thing here, in rereading the Federalist in preparation for this talk, not every single line, but in a great deal of it, I came to this one thought, namely that one of the worst things that ever happened in our country's history in terms of its leadership was Madison moving away from Hamilton and falling more and more in thrall to Jefferson. So yeah, when Madison and Hamilton were a team, couldn't be beaten. Okay, anyway, go ahead.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, N.E. The next one is a bit of a compliment, but it does end with a question from one Doug Baldwin. A tremendous presentation, says Doug. Would you be interested in pursuing your more ambitious presentation in the future? Perhaps a weekend seminar?
I don't know about programming, basic programming. I'd definitely be willing to pursue it in whatever platform seems best. But yes, I really was hoping to get back to Burke, and not enough time. Too many books and not enough time. But yeah, I wanted to really go back to the Burke because as I was reading it last time, I guess last spring, so many things seem to resonate with our contemporary political problems. So yeah, I really regret that I didn't have more time for the democracy part, and I didn't get to the revolution at all. But I mean, one idea, you'll remember in the reflections, Burke talks about two revolutions, not one. He's primarily reflecting on the French Revolution, but he begins by reflecting on the Glorious Revolution. And my simple thought is that the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, and the ratification of the Constitution of 1787 were similar kinds of revolutions and fall in a different category from the kind of revolution France experienced.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Joe. The next question comes from Tim Corneli, who asks, isn't Federalist number 29 about militia as a more professional and efficient alternative to either Minutemen or a full-time standing army?
I cited 29 for some tidbits, but yeah, but I'm not so conversant with it now as to be able to say something definitely. Let me just shoot from the hip here and say that yeah, we need something better than Minutemen, but I'm not sure that the argument is that the militias would be better than a standing army. Maybe I'm just too contemporary for that. I think it's a good thing we've got our standing army, and there's a lot of reason to be proud of its capabilities. So I wouldn't want to talk about the number. He wants to make. I don't think he's thinking of a large standing army. And therefore, what you need to have is effective militias, and they're going to be they got to be more effective than the Minutemen. And the way to make them effective is to have a uniform plan, so that when these different state groups come together, they're playing by the same rules. They know how to coordinate their actions. So that's my understanding of the thrust of those provisions in the Constitution about congressional regulation of militias, and and Publius's argument about it. So yes, militias are definitely better than Minutemen, but I'm not sure that Publius would think they're better than a standing army. What happened was the Civil War, and we decided we really needed a good army, and it's a good thing we got one, I think.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks, Tim, for your question. The next question is from Jeffrey Liss, who asks, to what extent has modern data crunching, so congressional elections are predictable, rendered prior tolerance of gerrymandering no longer conducive to control by the people?
The gerrymandering issue is something that's coming before the Supreme Court. I'm not really up on the cases, but yeah, it used to be gerrymandering, time-old practice, is now being looked upon as unacceptable. Now, as for number crunching, data crunching for elections. If I understand you right, I mean, the elections were pretty predictable. Elections to the House have been predictable for generations before any of this latest number crunching. But yeah, I think there's more and more questions being asked about gerrymandering. And like I said, I don't know the latest cases on this.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Jeffrey. The next question comes from Ray Lucchese again. Well, let me see if there's a question mark. Yes. The discussion seems to imply that Publius and the Constitution would have senators being appointed by state legislatures rather than by popular election within a state. Today, this seems counterintuitive and would appear undemocratic, although perhaps it's more federalist. The question, would Publius agree with popular election of senators, or would Publius say that senators have to be appointed by state legislatures?
Well, it was a concession. I mean, it used to be the Articles of Confederation, the legislature sent the delegates, end of story. And so this was kind of a sop. That's not the right word. This was trying to placate the critics who thought the Constitution was not federal enough by building in some federal element. Now, so I'm not sure, Publius, Publius thought he was preserving some degree of federalism, preserving some more of a role for the state by having them elected by the legislature. And we know what happened. We know that in the progressive era, by amendment, that was changed. I'm not so sure he would think of that as a good thing. My understanding is that in Germany, in the Federal Republic of Germany, elected state officials can actually serve in the Bundesrat. That they're state officials back in their own state, but they can also be part of the National Council. So the idea of having the state and its elected leaders play a large role in the federal councils isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's certainly not inconsistent with democracy, and it happens. It happens in Germany. Now, Tocqueville definitely thought, he attributed the higher quality of the senators to indirect election. Well, there's probably a host of other reasons to think that men serving for a 6-year term, a smaller number of them might be men and women of higher stature, but it's not clear that they were better because the state legislatures elected them, although that was a way of preserving a federal dimension to our government. It would be interesting to look at what kind of historical studies have been done about that.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Ray, for your question. And we're reaching the end of our time together today. So I'm going to skip down to a question that seems like a great exit question and perhaps exhortational, Joe. Jennifer Lind asks, as individual engaged citizens, what advice do you have for us to decrease the current polarization? Thank you for this wonderful discussion.
You're quite welcome. I'm enjoying the discussion as well. There's a book I haven't ever read that I'd like to read by Richard Fenno, the late Richard Fenno, called Home Style, in which he talks about how members of Congress regularly go back and talk to their constituents. It's really important for them, and it does play a role. They listen because they have an interest in doing so. So talking to your members of Congress, that would be one thing. So a concerned citizen, if you've got the time and the stomach for it, run for office, put yourself forward, talk to party leaders. There's something desperately wrong with our parties when they put winning office ahead of the good of the country. I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish or naive, but so getting involved in party organization, talking to the members of Congress when they come back. Those would be things that could be done. I would say, write to your congressman about the fairness doctrine in broadcasting. That would be something. Write to your congressman or talk to your congressman when you see him when he comes to visit about legislation on the various media. Those would be things.
Thank you, Joe.
These books. Have more people read these books.
Oh, you mean take the basic program of liberal education for adults at the Grand.
Boy, that would be a good start. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you, Jennifer, for your question. And now, as is customary, I'm going to ask you all to unmute so that Joe can hear the applause, unlike Beethoven.
Yay.
Bravo.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Yeah, they just
Thank you.
Super.
Very much.
Farewell, everybody. I'm going to end the broadcast here, but let me assure you that everything from the chat, especially your compliments for Joe, I'm going to harvest those and I'll email them to him. So he will see your kind words of appreciation.
Thank you,
All right.
Kendall.
Bye, everyone.